So, Dr. Bach, monarchs are always one of the most fascinating aspects in a historical period. The Hanoverian monarchs are no exception. Originally from Germany, they ruled England as foreigners. So, Dr. Bach, could you please briefly comment on each of them and what marks they left on this age?
Yes. I think the most important thing about the Hanoverian monarchs for the elite in England at the time is simply that they were Protestants. They defended the Protestant succession with which particularly the Whig party identified England's interests and character.
Yes.
So in 1701, Parliament had passed the Act of Settlement, which forbade a Catholic to become the monarch of England, and actually that statute is still on the statute book. George came from Hanover, George I, and he didn't speak much English at the beginning of his reign, at any rate. He spent a lot of time in Hanover. He actually died in Hanover and was buried there. He's the last British monarch not to be buried in England. And he had extremely bad relations with his own son. And
it seems to be a tradition to be having bad relationships.
That was the case, particularly with the first two Hanoverians, both George I and George II, who had very bad relations with their own eldest son. And because he was absent from England so much of the time, the actual running of the government fell into the hands eventually of a Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, who is generally regarded as the first Prime Minister of Britain. And George himself, although he had dictatorial powers in Hanover, had quite liberal tendencies in some respects in England, and was in favour of a certain alleviation of the penalties against Catholics, for example, which demonstrated a certain level of liberalism in the character that you might not have expected. Anyway, when he died, his son was very much constrained by the Prime Minister, Robert Walpole. George II was inclined to want to go to war, and eventually in the 1740s, Britain did go to war, the War of the Austrian Succession, and George II was the last king to lead a British army personally into battle in the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. Walpole famously said that when he heard the church bells ringing as to celebrate Britain going to war after so many years of peace, Walpole famously said they are ringing their bells now, but soon they'll be wringing their hands. And just like George I, and George II, George II and his eldest son, Frederick, who predeceased him, had very bad relationship, and Frederick supported political opposition to his father very often in Parliament. George III, I think, is quite different. George III was born in England, and he prided himself very much on his British identity, his English identity. He married for political reasons. He put aside his own preferences when it came to marriage. He was a very cultured man, particularly a collector of books. He has a terrible reputation with some people because of the American War of Independence, and the Americans painted him as a tyrant. And that's a nonsense, really, when you look at him personally. He was one of the last to be prepared to accept American independence, but certainly the behaviour of the British towards the Americans, it was not a royal tyranny, it wasn't a dictatorship over the American colonists, as we'll discuss later. He went mad, of course, in 1789, and then for the last 10 years of his reign, there was a regency of his son. He had blood disease, porphyria, very, very unfortunate monarch, I think. And the son, the eldest son, George IV, to be the Prince Regent, was absolutely gross and dissolute. An appalling example to the nation, very, very spendthrift. And by the end of his life, 1830, he weighed 130 kilograms. The cartoonists had a field day satirizing him and his obesity. He vastly built up and decorated Buckingham Palace, which his father had built, at the expense of the nation, of course. And then when he died without children, his brother William succeeded him, one of the many brothers. William is an interesting character in that he had a lot to do with the Navy. He'd worked in the Navy. He was a great friend of Nelson. Some of his political views were very reactionary. For example, he was not much in favor of the continuation of slavery in the colonies, but on the other hand, he was more liberal when it came to such matters as the penal laws on religion. So he too died without heir, and his niece Victoria succeeds at the age of 18, and until the present queen, she's been the longest reigning monarch. But I think really when we come to Victoria, we've reached a time when the monarch doesn't have substantial influence in politics anymore. She's very much a figurehead, and she certainly preferred some prime ministers to others. She liked Lord Melbourne at the beginning of her reign. She disliked Gladstone at the end of her reign, and was flattered by Disraeli, who offered her the title of Empress of India. But when it comes to substantial political influence, by Victoria's reign, the monarch is much more of a figurehead. And so I think the Glorious Revolution marks the dividing line. After the Glorious Revolution, the monarchy in England is limited. It's very much a constitutional government. It's not like France or Spain or Russia.
Yes, I like your comments that the Glorious Revolution is a dividing line. And actually, the Hanoverian monarchs are the first generations of monarchs after this dividing line. And thank you for your interesting comments on each of them. And I think their personality and temperament also led to some important political changes. And for more details, we are going to examine them in the video lectures. Thank you very much, Dr. Buck.